Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining me once again today. My name is General Confusion, and this is my wrap-up video on the Lizardmen. I think I've played through the faction pretty well. I've got a decent handle on them. Not quite as good as I had with the Skaven, but enough that I feel like I can talk about them with some level of confidence. So, the Lizardmen. Just from looking at the units listed, you can see right off the bat, the Lizardmen have a ton of large units. Something like half their roster is large units, which reflects the Lizardmen focus on large units and monsters, especially single entity monsters. Yes, they have cavalry, they have Kroxigors, but down here they have a huge variety of single entity monster units, and on top of that, their lords, their best lords, are or can be single entity monstrous units. And that really is the central building point of most Lizardman builds. It's possible to build a different army, but I feel like the single entity monsters really are the stars of the Lizardman army list. So, single entity monsters and high armor are the two things that make the Lizardmen special. You know, you look at Kroxgar on Grimlock, he has 100 armor. The Saurus Scar Veteran on the Carnosaur has 100 armor. So the lead damage-dealing monsters, the Bastiladons, have an incredible 140 armor, which is almost the highest in the game, I believe. Actually, it might be the highest in the game. I'm not certain if there is another unit with 140 points of armor. You know, setting aside temporary buffs. Ancient Stegodons have 140, Stegodons have 120, Kroxigors have 100, Feral Carnosaurs have 95. That's the lowest armor of the large monsters, and it's still very, very good. Even their cavalry, all of their cavalry is 90 armor or above, and many of them are shielded as well. Most of them are shielded. So, very, very tough to take out with ranged fire. So that is the theme of the Lizardmen. Very tough units, very hard to deal with except by specific counters. So let's talk in detail a little bit. This is kind of a generic army list that I've put up here. Not suitable for all matchups, but kind of a decent starting point. The Saurus Old Blood. I'm going to talk about the Saurus Old Blood and Kroxgar together because I feel like in many important ways they're basically the same unit. The Saurus Old Blood is budget Kroxgar, basically. He costs 300 less. You can mount him on his Carnosaur, and he costs 2,200, as opposed to Kroxgar's 2,600. The Saurus Old Blood basically just does everything Kroxgar does, but a little bit worse. He has slightly, I'm sorry, Kroxgar I think is, yeah, Kroxgar, okay. The Saurus Old Blood does not have an anti-large bonus. Kroxgar, even as an infantry unit, has an anti-large bonus, interestingly, which the Saurus Old Blood does not. The Saurus Old Blood has a shield. But other than that, the Saurus Old Blood has a little bit higher defense, a little bit lower attack, and a little bit less damage, plus a lower charge bonus. Now, mostly, you're going to see them mounted on monsters. So comparison-wise, I'm actually going to switch this guy over to Lizardmen so that I can compare directly. Over here I have the Old Blood, over here I'll have Kroxgar on Grimlock. And you can see, with Kroxgar on Grimlock compared to the Saurus Old Blood, he has a little bit more HP, quite a bit more attack, and slightly less defense, but quite a bit more damage and a higher charge bonus once again. So basically, Kroxgar is just better at all the things that you want your lord to do. And if you're taking the Saurus Old Blood or Kroxgar, usually you're taking them on the Carnosaur, and usually what you want them to do is hunt enemy targets, because Kroxgar, and the Saurus Old Blood to a lesser extent, but mainly Kroxgar, is a fantastic assassin. His weapon strength is huge, his charge bonus is huge, he has a big anti-large bonus. What he wants to do is get in there, find other lords and enemy monsters, and just rip them down, which he can do very, very effectively. Especially because the Sacred Spawning of Hotel, I think is how you pronounce that, and the Swiftness of Itzel combine to make him very fast. This pushes his speed up over 100 for 35 seconds. And this one gives him 22% physical resistance on top of all of his armor, plus 18% vigor, which helps keep him from getting exhausted and taking penalties. So, basically, Kroxgar is just a fantastic, fantastic assassin, and that is what you take him for. He can plow through the middle of a fight with his high mass, grab an enemy lord, and kill them or grab an enemy monster and kill them in quite short order. You can also take the Hand of the Gods. I think this is an arguable item. Sometimes it's very useful, sometimes it's not very useful, depending on the situation. You only get 2 shots of it, and it's very expensive, but it can be very, very good if you can get up fairly close and drop it like a bomb on whoever it is you're targeting. The Slan Mage Priests, I have been a little disappointed with. I have tried them out. I haven't really shown them off because they're kind of disappointing. They don't have any mount options, for one thing, which means that they are stuck being slow and low armor. They do have high hit points, which is fine, and they have magical melee attacks, but even so, they're not good at fighting. They do have Banishment as bound spell, which is nice. It is. And they have Greater Arcane Conduit, so they can cast a lot of spells. But other than that, they're basically just single lore spellcasters. You can take a Slan Mage Priest of Light if you want, for net, but in all honesty, these items I've tried once or twice each. They're cool. Aura of Quetzal is pretty good, but the Blood Statuette of Spite is, it's a cheap, weak Fate of Buna, basically. If you're going to take a Spellcaster Lord, you should take Mazdamundi, because Mazdamundi gets a selection of very powerful spells. He has the Net, he has Curse of the Midnight Wind, he has the Comet, he has Apotheosis, which is very useful, and he has Arcane Unforging, which I haven't used much because I don't think it's quite worth its cost, but it is pretty solid if you want to use it. The Sunburst Standard, pretty decent, but what really sells it for Mazdamundi is he gets both Ruination of Cities, which is very damaging, and Banishment as abilities on cooldown, and he can come on Zlak, which makes him a super powerful monster in addition to all of his spellcasting. So basically, when I take Mazdamundi, this is enough damage. If you cast these babies twice each in a battle, Mazdamundi will do a ton of damage unless they absolutely miss. So you don't even need the damage spells. You can take off Comet of Cassandora. You can take off Arcane Unforging. Apotheosis I really like. It's a great spell. Net of Amatok, of course, is a great spell. And then Harmonic Convergence, Curse of the Midnight Wind, arguable. I like to have them in some circumstances. Harmonic Convergence, of course, you can overcast to give extra armor. And Curse of the Midnight Wind, you could overcast to give an extended duration. So it will just make an enemy unit suck for almost a minute, which is pretty cool. But overall, they're secondary. You really take Mazdamundi for net, Banishment, and the Ruination of Cities. And of course, when he's on Zlak, he fears nothing. Mazdamundi can just plow through fights and not even care. So he's expensive. He will take up a lot of your army. Can be worth it. Slan Mage Priests, I would say not usually worth it. The heroes. The Skink Priests, great. I love Skink Priests. In particular, I love the fact that you could put them on Pterodons. You could, if you wanted, put them on Stegodons. And you could take a Skink Priest on a Stegodon, which would add to the monster mash, but is quite expensive. On the Pterodon, very cheap. Just take Wind Blast for the Heavens, or for Beasts. Nope, didn't mean to click that. For Beasts, of course, you can take Flock of Doom. And then they have other utility spells in the lores that you can bring along with you that are very handy. If you take Lore of Beasts, you can spawn a Manticore, which can be cool. Or you can take the Curse of Anra here to make enemy missile units suck. Or Pan's Impenetrable Pelt to help your infantry line get into combat. If you take Heavens, of course you can take the Harmonic Convergence, Curse of the Midnight Wind, the Comet, which is a very good spell, or even Chain Lightning if you really need more damage. I think as the Lizardmen, you should only take one spellcaster, because all of their Mazdamundi and both the Priests both have access to really good sets of spells, and you'll really want to be using them a lot. So, and Mazdamundi in particular can chew through a lot of magic by just casting spells over and over and over. So I wouldn't take two. If you take Krotgar, take a Priest. If you take Mazdamundi, don't take a Priest. You might consider taking some of the other heroes, because Lizardmen leadership all come with Cold-Blooded, which can be super useful for the healing, which is one of the main facets of the Lizardman list. The Saurus Scar Veteran is a mini Krotgar. Once again, you can put him on a Carnosaur, and he is another huge monster-killing monster. And he has the standard melee hero abilities. He can take a Potion of Strength. This can be useful, the Plaque of Dominion. Often I don't take it just because I think it's relatively irrelevant. If they're not going to break from being hit by a couple of Carnosaurs, probably -8 leadership won't do it. But so leadership-wise, I think it's very, very worthwhile as the Lizardmen to spend a lot of your points on leadership, to spend 3,000 or 4,000 points on leadership without flinching. Just do it. Because your leadership is so powerful and so useful. The Skink Priest, highly, highly mobile. The Skink Chief, very cheap on the Pterodon, can fly around just spitting darts at people and never be caught because of that 90 speed and slippery. Slippery boosts him up to like 120 speed. He can run away from literally anything in the game and still have poison missile attacks. So leadership, very, very good, especially because they all come with that cold-blooded just for free. So they can replenish the hit points of any given unit as long as you can pull them out of combat. Infantry-wise, Lizardmen are solid, but I would say unexceptional. They don't have any of the specialty infantry that the other factions have. They don't have anti-infantry bonuses. They don't have much armor piercing. They don't have stalking infantry. They have some stalking skirmishers, but they don't have any stalking infantry like the Skaven do. Basically, there are no standouts in this category. Skink cohorts, perfectly decent fodder for 300, which is a perfectly decent fodder price. Saurus warriors, perfectly solid mid-tier infantry for a perfectly decent mid-tier infantry price. Same with the shields. The Temple Guards are the only ones that stand out at all, because they have armor piercing and an anti-large bonus. But even then, their anti-large bonus isn't huge, and their stats are not terribly, terribly exceptional. So, for example, if you compare Temple Guard directly to Phoenix Guard, now Phoenix Guard do cost 200 more, and they have quite a bit less health. They also don't have shields, so in some ways you could consider them more vulnerable to missile fire. But the Phoenix Guard have a little more speed, a lot more melee attack, more melee defense, and this is without accounting for martial prowess. Their weapon strength is a little bit lower, and their charge bonus is a little bit lower, but their bonus versus large is bigger, and they have 30% physical resistance, and they cause fear. So, overall, I would say Temple Guard sort of lack by comparison. They're decent for their price. They are no more than decent. And a unit of Temple Guard going toe-to-toe with another unit of elite infantry is going to suffer badly. I remember one battle I had, where a siege battle actually, just playing around with friends, where I had a unit of Storm Vermin, Sword, and Shields fighting with a unit of Temple Guard all battle. Nobody else interfered with the fight. They were just slugging it out head-to-head, and it was dicey who was going to win. So that's a 1,050 point unit taking on a 1,200 point unit comfortably without much of a problem. So Temple Guard, they're there. They're useful if you need a lot of armor-piercing anti-large. Temple Guard are where it's at. Saurus Spears do pretty well in the role, though, because they do have reasonable AP damage, and their bonus versus large is just as big. 15 versus 16, there's no real difference. Missile-wise, Skink cohorts with javelins are not actually missile infantry. They have exactly the same stats as the regular Skink cohorts, they just also have javelins. So use them as line infantry. Basically, the javelins are there to give them a little bit of punch before they charge in. They're precursor javelins. And they're also useful against flyers. Skink skirmishers, I don't think are worth much because, yeah, they have poison ranged attacks, but their damage is low, their range is low, their melee stats are pitiful, so they can't defend themselves. Now, they do have 90 units, 90 models, as opposed to the Chameleon Skink's 68 models. But in a skirmisher, that actually makes them a little bit harder to manage, because they're easier to catch, because they have so many more models. And, of course, they have less HP per model than Chameleon Skinks do, and also fairly low leadership. So, they're cheap, I still don't think they're terribly worth it. Chameleon Skinks, on the other hand, are really good. They stalk, they have 40% missile resistance, so they can win missile fights outright sometimes. Their melee stats are not terrible, and their melee attacks are also poisonous, so they debuff people in melee with them. Their leadership is okay, they have high speed, and they do pretty good missile damage. So, and of course they can fire while moving, and they have a 360-degree firing arc. So Chameleon Skinks, very, very solid. An excellent skirmisher unit. They're like gutter runners, but cheaper because they don't have the same fighting capability in melee, and they have less of an HP pool, fewer models. But in their role, they're more specialized, basically. In their role, I think they're just as efficient as Skaven gutter runners. So, here's the thing about talking about infantry and skirmishers here. the infantry is not the core of a Lizardman list. I mean, if you look at like this sample list I built up here, yeah, I have infantry to form a battle line, but the infantry are not going to be the ones who survive to the end of the battle. They're not going to be the ones to do most of the heavy lifting. They're not going to be the ones to get most of the kills. The core of the army list is down here. Cavalry is very much a secondary thought to the Lizardmen. Cold One Spear Riders, Cold One Riders, they're fairly cheap for cavalry. They're slow. They have speed 66, so they're heavy cavalry speed without the heavy cavalry stats to back it up. They do have high armor, which is good, and shields, so they're resilient against missiles, but stats-wise, Cold One Spear Riders remind me of nothing so much as Boar Boy Biggins, and Boar Boy Biggins are good in their role, but not good at anything else. And that's where Cold One Spear Riders are. Cold One Spear Riders are only worth anything like their price if they are countercharging enemy cavalry. Horned Ones are interesting because their price increase comes in large part, I mean, they're better in all kinds of ways, including a much better melee attack. Defensively, though, they're about the same. They're about as fragile as Cold One Spear Riders. They do a lot more damage, though, and they're faster. So they have more like a light cavalry speed, which makes them more useful in some ways. Now, I like Horned Ones as a counter to Doom Wheels. I like them as a counter to other heavily armored cavalry, although you can't take them in against anything with an anti-large bonus because they'll melt. So cavalry-wise, unexceptional. I've tried the Feral Cold Ones several times. They're just too cheap. They don't... If they can get into infantry, they do pretty well. If they get caught by enemy cavalry, they disappear. Cold One Riders just don't really have anything to recommend them. I mean, in any situation where I would feel the need for Cold One Riders, I would just as well take Cold One Spear Riders, or even suck up the extra cost and take Horned Ones, which would probably be more effective than the Cold One Riders would be, because they have the higher damage, the higher charge bonus, the higher everything, basically. Only their melee defense is the same. So then we get into the meat of the Lizardman army, which is the monsters. I think 2 Revivification Crystals are a staple, because they give you that extra healing boost you need to keep your units in the fight, particularly because the crystals can bring units back from the dead. They can return models to life. So if you drop them on a badly damaged unit of, say, Croxagores, all of a sudden they can boost your killing power significantly back up towards what it should be at the top of their game. Feral Stegodons and Feral Bastillodons, they're hampered by their feral nature, by the fact that they will go crazy, but they can still be excellent at soaking up fire and disrupting enemy lines. So I often have a Feral Bastillodon like this one right here, just out in front, to absorb arrows and artillery fire and all of that stuff. And if it dies, I don't really care, because it's cheaper than my Saurus Warriors. The Feral Carnosaur. Feral Carnosaurs, once again, they're feral. They're easy for the enemy to kite and lead around by the nose once they start rampaging. That said, if you want to take the anti-large power of a Carnosaur without paying for a Lord or a Saurus Scar Veteran, then the Feral Carnosaur is a pretty good choice. That said, I would probably just take a Scar Veteran. A Scar Veteran on a Carnosaur, yeah, he's more expensive by about 500 points, but he's better in a lot of ways. Better leadership, slightly better damage, slightly better charge bonus. And, of course, he has abilities, and he comes with Cold-Blooded. So, overall, I think I would rather take the Saurus Scar Veteran than the Feral Carnosaur. Pterodon Riders and Pterodon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas are great skirmishing units. They also can work very well running interference for your Flying Priest, which, once again, I think is very important, to have that kind of spellcasting ability. You can't really throw them into melee because their melee stats aren't great, but once they've used up their ammo, they can charge in. And Pterodon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas, in particular, do quite a bit of damage to infantry. They're actually very good at doing it. They also have this Death from Above. Not great. It's one bomb, basically. It does damage, some damage, but not a whole lot. The Pterodon Riders with the Poison Darts, they can actually be good snipers, because, you see, they fire about every 5 seconds, and they do reasonable damage. They can also be excellent at applying poison, so you can circle them around the battle line, apply poison to key enemy units to debuff them so that your troops have a chance to fight. The Solar Engine is your only option for long-range artillery. Well, actually, I tell a lie. The Stegodon is longer range than it. The Solar Engine does a lot of damage. It's a flaming magical attack. It has this blinded debuff that it applies, which is pretty great. And of course, it's also a Stegodon. Or, I'm sorry, a Bastiladon. But it doesn't rampage, which makes it much more valuable than the Feral Bastiladon because you can use it as part of a Death Ball in the late game. The Stegodon has this big old crossbow on the back. I haven't found the crossbow to be very efficient. It does a lot of damage when it hits, but it can only really hit one target or a couple of infantry maybe. And I don't know. I haven't had a whole lot of success with it. The Ancient Stegodon really pays back for itself if there is a bunch of infantry. However, it's very expensive, so you're putting a lot of your eggs into one basket. And when you've already got a 2,500 point Lord, and a couple of 1,000 point Bastiladons and Croxagors and all of that, the Ancient Stegodon can be hard to justify. For instance, to fit one in this army, I would have to get rid of quite a bit, probably a Croxagor and a couple of Saurus Warriors. Then I get the Ancient Stegodon and have a few points left over for some skinks or something. Croxagors, I think, are fantastic. They're excellent anti-infantry. They can fight anti-large, although not as well, but these guys can munch through even most anti-large infantry. Only elite armor-piercing halberds really have a chance of stopping the Croxagors, and even against them, the Croxagors will score reasonable kills. When you have that low melee attack, a bonus versus infantry of 18 is really, really valuable. I mean, it boosts their melee attack up to 44, which is high. You know, high enough that even against the Phoenix Guard, they will be doing damage. Against the White Lions, they absolutely thrash White Lions, and Spearmen for that matter. So, the basic strategy for the Lizardmen, as I said in the strategy video I put out a little while back, is to bust through, to use their mass and concentration of force to get through where they need to get through, to take out threatening units preferentially, and at the end of the battle to form kind of a death ball. You know, if you have Krotgar, these revivification crystals, maybe some Croxagors, that's a very, very tough nut for your opponent to crack with what they happen to have left at the end of the battle. So long as you focus on taking out anti-large units before that phase, then at the end you'll find there's nothing that can really threaten that. You can do the same thing with Mazdamundi. Mazdamundi on Slack is extremely hard to kill. And because all of these units are causing terror, it's almost impossible for a weakened enemy to deal with them effectively. So you could take Lord Mazdamundi, and he will survive to the end of the battle if you manage him and drop heals on him. Like, he's very difficult to kill. Krotgar, much, much easier considering he has much less health. Like 1,000 less health and less armor. So overall, the Lizardmen, I find Lizardmen armies often play almost more like a gang of heroes than an army. I mean, the army exists to support these guys, exist to support these guys, basically. Like, this army is 4 units plus a bunch of support. All of this is support. This is the meat of the army right there. I guess I could throw the Skink Priest in. That's the meat of the army right there. All this is support. And it's interesting to have a faction where the infantry line are support units. They're not the heart of the army. I mean, in most factions, the infantry is what matters. But with the Lizardmen, as with the Skaven, the infantry is not what matters. What matters is the heroes and the specialists. And I think that's actually fantastic game design. I really appreciate the way that that's been sort of built in, as opposed to Warhammer 1, where the infantry was really where most of the attention on the army was going to be spent. So, that's about it for the Lizardmen. I think, like I said, I think I've got a pretty good handle on how they function. Now, let me divert a little bit to say, as I said, you can build an infantry-focused Lizardman army. You know, you can take, you can take a whole bunch of Saurus warriors, maybe some Temple Guard. So long as you have skirmishers to back them up, you can do this very successfully. You can take Krotgar on a Cold One. Instead of Grimlock, throw him in with a unit of Cold One Spear Riders to use, you know, for cavalry flanking. You have some anti-large in there, some more on the flanks, some skirmishers. You have spellcasting still, because you still have that Skink Priest. You could even put him on foot if you wanted, although that's very dangerous. I wouldn't do that usually. But so this kind of an army build can also be successful, especially if your opponent has been expecting a lot of large monsters and so has built an army based around countering large. Then the infantry rush can take them by surprise and be very effective. That said, I do think building an infantry Lizardman army is leaving a whole lot of money on the table. You're really... I mean, the Revivification Crystal alone, I almost feel like you need that in order to really abuse that Lizardman healing ability. The Solar Engine is a great little artillery piece. Croxagores are fantastic anti-infantry. Those 3 units alone, by cutting them out, I feel like you're losing a lot of the power of the Lizardman list. And then, of course, you have the Ancient Stegodon, the Feral Carnosaur, the Pterodon Riders. I think basically Monster Mash is what Lizardmen are designed for. A Lizardman army should usually have a whole bunch of large units in it. You should be having at least a couple of monsters just rocking around the battlefield, tearing it up. And as long as you play that way, I think it's relatively straightforward to find success. Micromanagement-wise, Lizardmen do have to micromanage their healing. These Revivification Crystals only pay off if every 45 seconds when it comes off cooldown, you're back on the crystal dropping the heal on somebody. In some ways, it doesn't even matter exactly who you drop the heal on. I mean, obviously, you have to preferentially target your most important assets, but so long as you've got the healing going on somebody, that's 600 more hit points that your enemy will have to chew through, and 600 more hit points is 600 more hit points. If you can effectively multiply the HP of your army in this way, and your opponent can't, then you have a big advantage right off the bat, even if you're not using it in the most optimal way. So definitely pay attention to the crystals. Definitely pay attention to your lord. If it's Krotgar or Mazdamundi, the lords are super important for the Lizardmen, even more important than they are for most other factions. And then pay attention to your big killing monsters and your flanking power. The infantry can more or less take care of itself. Saurus are tough. You throw them into an infantry fight, they'll either win or they'll lose. They'll probably win if you're supporting them properly and dropping a heal on them occasionally. And even if they lose, they'll take a lot of the enemy with them. Your skirmishers, once again, can pretty much handle themselves. You do have to remember to sweep them around the flanks sometimes. But it's the Croxagores and the monsters that you should be, paying attention to most of the time. And so long as you remember that, and get through the front line to take out the ranged damage, all that kind of good stuff, you can use the Lizardmen very successfully, even in tough matchups, even against the Dark Elves. Lizardmen can win. It's a bit of an uphill battle, but it can be done. So thank you all so much for watching. My next videos, I'll be going over to the Elves, and I'll be covering the Elves kind of both at the same time, because I feel like the High Elves and the Dark Elves actually have a lot of similarities. Obviously, there are important differences, and I'll be talking about those differences very distinctly, because they change the way the factions are handled. But especially in the infantry line, there are also a lot of parallels, which I think have been deliberately drawn by CA. And of course, the bolt throwers are exactly identical. The dragons are similar, although not identical. But so I'll be talking about those over the next few days, and as Mortal Empires get fired up, I'll be moving into discussing these factions in the context of the Warhammer 1 factions, and talking about the changes that have happened between Warhammer 1 and Mortal Empires just a little bit. So stay tuned. Thank you all so much for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel if you like what you see and what you hear, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.